Welcome to another English Solutions for Business and Life video. Today we will be looking at book Global Intermediate, Pre-Intermediate, the grammar section of Unit 6. In Unit 6 we will be looking at the grammar section with comparatives, superlatives, and phrasal verbs. We will look at how to use them and how to structure them in a sentence. So let's start with comparatives. What are comparatives? Well, comparatives are words that are used to compare two people or objects. They usually are written or talked about with the than. We will look at some examples later. And the structure is for short verbs, for short adjectives, we use the adjective and then we add the er after it. For longer adjectives, we use more and then we add the adjective after it. We don't change it like we do with the er. It stays the same. Now, there are more different types of comparatives, but we will look at them later on when we look at some examples. And they can also be used to compare two actions. Okay, so let's look now at some examples. Adam is taller than Steve. Adam is taller than Steve. Here, the comparative word is taller. As you can see, we use than to indicate that we're comparing two people. In this case, Adam and Steve. Adam is taller than Steve. In this example, we can assume that Adam is the taller one, like here, and Steve is the shorter one, because we're comparing them, saying Adam is taller than Steve. Let's look at another example without the er ending. Apples are more expensive than pears. Apples are more expensive than pears. Here the comparative is more expensive than. More expensive, we use more here because expensive is a longer adjective. We cannot say expensiver because that's not correct. Er, the er ending like this, is used for shorter adjectives. Another example, you could write better in high school. You could write better in high school. Here we are comparing two actions, writing now and writing in high school. So before, this person could write better. That means that her handwriting was with a bit better quality. Okay, now let's look at some more comparative rules or words. We use the less comparative word, less, and an adjective after it when we're saying that something is not as much as another thing. It depends on the adjective, really, what we're talking about. You'll see some examples later. Then we also use not, as, and then the adjective, and then another as to compare two objects. To make comparisons, it can be more than or less than. We also use as, and then the adjective, and then as again, to say that two things are the same. And then we use a bit or much followed by the adjective to modify comparative adjectives and adverbs. Modify them meaning that they are less with less strength or with higher strength. Let's look at some examples in case you got lost a little bit. Luisa is less tall than John. As you can see here, the comparative we're using is less than. Less than. And here the adjective is tall. So if we use the example that we used before, less than means this. That is not as much as something. So she's less tall, meaning that Luisa would therefore be the shorter one. Like this. And John would be the tallest one. Okay? Another comparative word is not as, and then another as, and then the not. This means that we're making a comparison between two people. Fred is not as active as Liam. Fred is not as active as Liam. Let's look at another example. Chinese is a bit more difficult than English. A bit means that in its scale, Chinese is more difficult than English, but not very difficult, not much more difficult than English. This is just an example, of course. Everyone can have their own opinion about how difficult Chinese can be compared to English. So let's look at another one, also talking about languages. German is much harder than French, or much more difficult than French. Here we are talking the comparative adjective. The adjective is harder. Here in the other one, in the past one, the comparative adjective was more difficult. So we have modified them by adding a bit or much before them. And they are still harder, they're still more difficult, but a bit is less than much. As you can see. And they are still compared to the, well, in the comparisons, they still mean more. Okay, that's it for comparative adjectives. Now, what happens when something cannot be compared with because of how much it is a certain adjective? What I mean is, for example, in superlatives. We use superlatives when we're comparing two things, but one of them wins over the other. For this, we use the adjective and then we add an est at the end for short adjectives. For longer adjectives, we add the most before the adjective, just like we did add er after the comparative, or more before the comparative adjective. Here we're talking about the superlative, meaning that it's at the top of the scale. Here, at the top. So, and we also often use the present perfect for superlative adjectives. For example, Alfred is the largest kid in the class. largest here is a superlative. And here it means that no one else in the class is as large as Alfred. So let's imagine the class being these little circles. Everyone else is a regular size, but Alfred here is the largest. Another example, Johnny is the most experienced one. We could be talking about kids in the class, but we could also be talking about a salesman. Johnny is the most experienced salesman I've met. Here I added this to help you notice that we normally use the present perfect tense. I've met. This is present perfect, meaning that of all the salesmen we have met or we know, Johnny is the most experienced. No one is as experienced as Johnny. Okay, so that's it for comparative and superlative adjectives. So now let's look at the next section of the grammar in this unit. Phrasal verbs and objects. Phrasal verbs and objects are verbs that are compound verbs, meaning that they can have two words to describe them or to describe an action. They can take an object or they can not take an object. This meaning that we can use them with the object, like turn on the computer, turn on being the phrasal verb and the computer being the object, or shut down the computer. They take objects because we have to specify what object we're shutting down, turning off, turning on, etc. Or they can also be phrasal verbs that do not take an object. For example, log on, stand up, sit down, more actions that a person does without specifying the object that they need to do the action with. In the case that we have to specify the object that the action needs to be done with, we normally put the phrasal verb before the particle. Or we can also place it after the particle. But in the case that we use a pronoun, it can only go between the verb and the particle. So as you can see, when it's an object and it's not a pronoun, the phrasal verb goes before the particle but after the verb, of course. Or we can say the verb, then the particle, and then the phrasal verb. Both are correct, but in the case of talking about a pronoun, as I already mentioned, it has to go between the verb and the particle. It cannot go another way around. Let's look at some examples. I take out the trash. This is a phrasal verb that needs an object or takes an object. Here the object is the trash. Take out is the phrasal verb. It's a verb that has two words, take and out. It means a different action than take alone. We add the out, meaning that we take it and we put it outside. Well, that's a simple explanation. So what happens when we have to add or replace the object with it? Well, remember, it has to go between the particle, in this case out, and the verb. in this case take. This being the pronoun, we'll highlight in yellow. Take it out. Take what out? The trash. It being the trash. Another example. Can you stand up, please? Well, in this case, this action or this phrasal verb, stand up, does not take an object. This is just an action that a person does without an object. So we don't need to place the object anywhere. It can be at the end, or it's not written at all in this specific action. In the book, we saw different phrasal verbs such as turn on the computer, shut down the computer, and we can also say shut the computer down. So I hope these other examples have helped you understand a little bit better how phrasal verbs are used, and if you have any more questions, make sure that you ask them to your teacher. Okay, so that's it for this lesson for the grammar section of Unit 6. I hope you enjoyed it and this video has helped you understand better the grammar part of this unit. Okay, that's it for this video then. See you next time.